The year is 1952. A man arrives at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, a place locals simply call Angola. He steps off a prison transport bus, squinting against the flat Mississippi Delta sun. Ahead of him, 18,000 acres of farmland stretch to the horizon. There are no city skylines, no roads out. The only thing between him and freedom is the Mississippi River on 3 sides and armed guards on horseback on the 4th. He is handed a hoe, not a prison uniform, not a cell assignment. Ahu, because at Angola, the first thing they teach you, before anything else, is that you will work this land. You will plant it, harvest it, sweat into it. And for many men who passed through those gates, that land became the only world they ever knew again. Angola is not just a prison. It is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. 18,000 acres carved out of former plantation in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. At its peak, it housed over 5,000 men. More than 85% of them were serving life sentences. And for decades, the odds of ever leaving alive were almost mathematically zero. But men lived here, some for 40, 50 years. They built lives inside these walls. They found purpose, identity, community, sometimes even joy, in a place designed to offer none of those things. How does a human being adapt to a sentence that has no end? How do you build a life inside a cage the size of a small town? And what does that adaptation cost you, mentally, physically, spiritually? That is what this video is about. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications, because what happens inside Angola, the survival strategies, the hidden economies, the psychological transformations, will challenge everything you think you know about human resilience. Angola was built on land that was already soaked in suffering before a single prison wall went up. The plantation that became the Louisiana State Penitentiary was named after the African country from which its enslaved workers were believed to have originated. After the Civil War, Louisiana, like many southern states, used convict leasing, a system that historians and legal scholars have called slavery by another name, to continue extracting forced labor from black men on that same land. By the time convict leasing was formally abolished in Louisiana in 1901, Angola had already been operating as a state prison for nearly 2 decades. The fields remained. The labor remained. The racial composition of the prison population remained overwhelmingly black. This history is not background noise. It is the foundation on which every inmate who ever arrived at Angola had to build a life. Because you cannot understand how men adapt to Angola without understanding what Angola was built to be. For most of the 20th century, Angola's conditions were described by investigators, journalists, and former inmates as catastrophically brutal. A 1952 self-mutilation protest, in which 31 inmates slashed their own heel tendons to avoid being sent back to work in the fields, drew national media attention and a federal investigation. Wilbert Rideau arrived at Angola in 1962, sentenced to death at the age of 19. He would spend the next 44 years inside its walls, eventually becoming editor of the Angolite, Angola's inmate-run prison newspaper, a position that gave him an unparalleled view of how the institution shaped and broke human beings. In his 2010 memoir, Rideau described arriving as a teenager to a world governed by brutality, hierarchy, and informal systems of survival that had nothing to do with anything the state had designed. The first adaptation every new inmate had to make was psychological. The recognition that the rules governing life at Angola were not the rules posted on any wall. There were the official rules, the Louisiana Department of Corrections policies, the written code of conduct, the formal disciplinary system. And then there were the real rules. Who you could trust, who you could not. Which spaces were controlled by which groups. What you could say, what you could not afford to say. What you owned, what could be taken. 4 new arrivals, called fish in Angola's internal vocabulary. The first days were a period of intense, often terrifying orientation. According to documented testimony from former inmates and journalistic accounts published by the Angolite and by outside reporters, new inmates were rapidly assessed by the existing population. Were they affiliated with anyone? Did they know someone inside? Did they carry themselves with confidence or with visible fear? Fear, in Angola's social ecosystem was currency, but only for those who could exploit it. The prison was organized into living units called camps. These camps were not single cells. They were large dormitory-style sleeping arrangements where dozens of men lived in close proximity. This arrangement, which persisted for decades at Angola, was a consequence of the plantation layout. Angola did not look like a conventional prison. It looked like a series of work camps spread across thousands of acres of farmland, because that is exactly what it was. In that environment, with limited private space and constant surveillance, not just from guards but from other inmates, the psychological pressure was relentless. There was no retreat. There was no off switch. You were always observed. You were always being read. The men who survived Angola's early days, the fish period, were those who rapidly learned to present a coherent, stable identity. Not necessarily a tough identity. Not necessarily an aggressive one, but a consistent one. Men who appeared unpredictable, erratic, or too visibly frightened became targets. Men who could appear calm, even if they were not calm, bought themselves time. Time, in Angola, was the only resource that was given to you in unlimited supply. The question was what you did with it. If the first adaptation in Angola was psychological, the second was economic. Every closed society develops its own economy. Angola was no exception, and the economy that evolved inside those 18,000 acres was sophisticated, durable, and almost entirely invisible to the outside world. For much of Angola's history, inmates were paid nothing, or nearly nothing, for their labor. Louisiana was one of the last states in the country to continue mandatory unpaid prison labor well into the modern era. According to the Louisiana Department of Corrections, inmates working farm assignments at Angola historically received no wages. In recent years, some work assignments began carrying nominal pay, as little as 2 cents per hour in certain classifications. Against the cost of basic necessities available through the prison canteen, soap, writing materials, snacks, hygiene products, that pay was effectively meaningless. So inmates built their own systems. The informal economy at Angola, documented extensively by the Angolite and by journalists, including those from the Marshall Project and The Atlantic, ran on a network of exchange that was creative, hierarchical, and constantly policed, not by the state but by the inmates themselves. Cigarettes were the original currency. Before smoking bans reached Angola, a pack of cigarettes had a known, stable value that everyone understood. Cigarettes could be traded for food from the kitchen, for protection, for information, for labor. A man who could cook in the kitchen and divert extra food built social capital. A man who could fix shoes, cut hair, repair clothing, skills that in the outside world would earn a modest hourly wage. Inside, Angola earned safety and status. The barbers were particularly important figures in Angola's social ecosystem. A haircut sounds trivial. In a place where personal appearance is one of the few domains of self-expression left to a man, it is not trivial. Former inmates have described the barber's chair as one of the few spaces in Angola where genuine conversation happened, where information moved, where alliances were quietly formed or tested. The kitchen workers held a different kind of power. Access to food, additional food, better food, food that deviated from the standard institutional diet, was deeply meaningful in an environment of monotony and deprivation. Accounts from former inmates describe kitchen workers as having influence that extended far beyond their job title. But the informal economy had a shadow side. Every system of exchange creates debt, and in Angola, debt was dangerous. The practice that human rights investigators and former inmates described most consistently was what was called making groceries, an arrangement in which one inmate would purchase commissary items for another on credit, with repayment expected in labor, sexual favors, or future goods. Human Rights Watch's 1995 report on Angola, which interviewed dozens of current and former inmates and staff, documented the prevalence of sexual coercion tied to debt arrangements. The report described a world in which young, physically smaller, or socially unconnected inmates were systematically targeted for exploitation. This was not an aberration. It was a documented structural feature of Angola's social order for decades. The state's response to these dynamics, for most of Angola's history, was largely indifference. Guards knew what was happening. Investigations confirmed they knew. But in an environment where security staffing was thin and the population enormous, the informal systems of inmate social control were often allowed to function because they reduced visible disorder. The men who navigated this economy successfully, who found a niche, built a reputation, maintained relationships that offered mutual protection, were the ones who endured. Not necessarily the strongest, not necessarily the most violent. The ones who understood the system well enough to work within it without becoming its victims. Norris Henderson, who spent 27 years at Angola after being wrongfully convicted of murder and was eventually exonerated in 2003, described the social intelligence required to survive Angola as extraordinary. In multiple public interviews and testimony before legislative committees, Henderson described learning, within his first weeks, that Angola had a social architecture as complex as any institution he had ever encountered, and that navigating it required a constant, exhausting, socially demanding performance. The performance never stopped, not even when you were asleep. Angola was designed to break time, not to use it, not to fill it productively, to make it meaningless. Sentences without end, days without variation, seasons marked only by whether you were harvesting soybeans or corn. For men serving life, and at Angola, that was most of the population, time was not an ally. It was the enemy. The psychological literature on long-term incarceration, including studies published in journals, including the American Journal of Public Health, documents consistent patterns among men serving decades-long sentences. Depression, institutionalization, what researchers call prisonization, the process by which a person's personality, values, and cognitive patterns are progressively reshaped by the institutional environment until the individual becomes, in some measurable sense, a different person. At Angola, the threat of prisonization was existential. Because you were not serving 5 years or 10 years. You were serving the rest of your life. And the question, consciously or not, that every long-term inmate at Angola eventually had to confront was this: who am I going to be for the next 50 years? The men who found answers to that question, real answers, not just survival strategies, were the ones who created meaning inside the institution. One of the most remarkable documented examples of meaning creation at Angola was the Angolite, the inmate-run prison newspaper. Established in 1953 and still publishing, the Angolite became, under the editorship of Wilbert Rideau, beginning in the 1970s, one of the most respected prison publications in American history. It won multiple journalism awards. It was cited in academic papers. It was read by policymakers. And it was written, edited, and produced entirely by men serving life sentences in a maximum security prison in rural Louisiana. Rideau described the Angolite not as a hobby, but as a lifeline. In his memoir and in extensive interviews, he articulated something that might seem counterintuitive. That Angola, precisely because it offered so little, forced him to develop capacities he might never have found in the outside world. The deprivation was real. The suffering was real, but in that deprivation, he found a kind of clarity. He was not alone. The Angola Prison Rodeo, which began in 1965 and still runs annually, is one of the most unusual documented phenomena in American penal history. Every October, the gates of Angola open and thousands of members of the public pay to watch inmates compete in rodeo events. Events that include bull riding, barrel racing, and a game called Guts and Glory, in which a poker chip is attached to a bull's head and inmates try to grab it while the bull is still moving. The rodeo is controversial. Critics, including prison reform advocates and some former inmates, have described it as a spectacle that commodifies inmates' bodies for public entertainment. The comparisons to gladiatorial display are not subtle, but for many inmates who participated, the rodeo meant something else. For men who spent 364 days a year invisible, unseen, unnamed, reduced to a number, the rodeo was one day when the public looked at them, when they had an audience, when what they did with their bodies and their courage mattered to someone beyond the walls. Former Angola inmates, in interviews with journalists and documentary filmmakers, have consistently described the rodeo as one of the most psychologically complex experiences of their incarceration, simultaneously demeaning and electrifying. A performance of selfhood in a place designed to erase it. Religion played an equally significant role in Angola's psychological ecosystem. Beginning in the 1990s under Warden Burl Cain, Angola underwent a transformation that Cain himself described as a moral rehabilitation effort centered on Christian conversion and biblical education. A Bible college, the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary Extension, was established inside Angola's walls. By the time of Cain's departure in 2015, hundreds of Angola inmates had earned theological degrees. The program was contested. Secular critics questioned the constitutional appropriateness of state-supported religious programming in a prison. Former inmates gave mixed accounts. Some described the seminary as genuinely transformative. Others described it as a performance required for parole consideration or to access certain privileges. But the numbers told a partial story. Angola's disciplinary incident rates declined measurably during the period of expanded religious programming, according to Louisiana Department of Corrections data. Whether the cause was genuine moral transformation, better inmate management, selection effects, or some combination, the pattern was documented. If you have watched this far, you already understand that Angola is not a simple story. It is not a story about monsters or about saints. It is a story about human beings in an impossible environment, making impossible choices, trying to remain, in some meaningful sense, human. Stay with us, because what happens next, what Angola does to men after 20, 30, 40 years, is where the story becomes something most people are not prepared to hear. After 20 years inside Angola, something begins to happen to a man's relationship with the outside world. It does not disappear. It warps. Criminologists and psychologists who have studied long-term incarceration, including researchers from the University of California and documented in publications like the Journal of Criminal Justice, describe a phenomenon sometimes called institutionalization, or, more colloquially, doing time until time does you. The individual becomes functionally adapted to the prison environment in ways that make the outside world progressively less legible. Men who arrived at Angola in their 20s, who remembered cars, restaurants, grocery stores, crowds, the sound of children playing in a park, found that after 2 or 3 decades, those memories had the quality of something experienced by someone else. The outside world had not stood still while they were inside. It had transformed. Cell phones, the internet, ATM machines, GPS. The social landscape of American life had rewritten itself while they were working the soybean fields of West Feliciana Parish. This created a paradox that former Angola inmates described consistently in post-release interviews. The very adaptations that made a man safe inside Angola made him dangerous to himself outside of it. The vigilance that kept you alive in a dormitory full of potentially hostile men became paranoia on a city bus. The emotional flatness that protected you from the daily indignities of incarceration became an inability to connect with family members who had waited decades for you to come home. The hierarchies of respect and threat that governed every interaction inside Angola, where the wrong word at the wrong moment could escalate to violence, made ordinary social interactions feel like minefields. Norris Henderson, after his 2003 exoneration, spoke extensively in public forums about the strangeness of freedom. He described standing in a grocery store, overwhelmed by the number of choices available in a single aisle, an experience that sounds mundane until you understand that for 27 years, every choice about what he ate, wore, or did with his body had been made for him by the state of Louisiana. Henderson went on to found Voice of the Experienced, a New Orleans-based criminal justice advocacy organization run by formerly incarcerated people. His trajectory, from Angola inmate to policy advocate, was unusual, but it illustrated something important, that the adaptive capacity developed inside Angola, channeled outward, could be formidable. For those who were never released, and at Angola, that was the majority, the long-term adaptation took different forms. Some men became the institution. They built identities entirely within Angola's social structure. They became the elder statesmen of their dormitory, the men new arrivals came to for advice. They accumulated knowledge of the system, its rhythms, its rules, its pressure points, that made them valuable as informal mediators between inmates and staff. Angola's administration, under various wardens over the decades, often relied on these elder inmates to help manage the population. It was an unofficial arrangement. It was also, in its way, a form of power, perhaps the only form available. Some men turned inward. They built lives of the mind, reading, writing, studying, praying. The Angola Library, documented in journalistic accounts, was one of the more heavily used prison libraries in the Louisiana system. Men who arrived illiterate taught themselves to read. Men who arrived barely educated earned GED equivalencies. Some, through the seminary program, earned bachelor's degrees. In a place that offered almost nothing, education was the one door that remained partially open. Some men died there. Angola has its own cemetery, a place called Point Lookout, located on the prison grounds. Men who die at Angola and whose families do not claim their bodies are buried there, marked with simple white crosses. For decades, Angola inmates built the coffins, dug the graves, and buried their fellow prisoners themselves. The cemetery is one of the most documented and haunting features of Angola's physical landscape, a place where the institution's logic is expressed in its most final form. The men who worked in Point Lookout, who dug the graves and built the coffins, described the work in terms that were both practical and deeply affecting. It was a job. It was also a confrontation with the most fundamental truth of Angola, that for most of the men who entered, those 18,000 acres were where their story ended. Some men died there. Angola has its own cemetery, a place called Point Lookout, located on the prison grounds. Men who die at Angola and whose families do not claim their bodies are buried there, marked with simple white crosses. For decades, Angola inmates built the coffins, dug the graves, and buried their fellow prisoners themselves. The cemetery is one of the most documented and haunting features of Angola's physical landscape, a place where the institution's logic is expressed in its most final form. The men who worked in Point Lookout, who dug the graves and built the coffins, described the work in terms that were both practical and deeply affecting. It was a job. It was also a confrontation with the most fundamental truth of Angola, that for most of the men who entered, those 18,000 acres were where their story ended. Norris Henderson, speaking at a 2019 symposium on criminal justice reform, put it this way: Angola teaches you how to live inside Angola. That's all it teaches you. Everything else you have to unlearn. And yet, some men made it. Some of the men who left Angola after decades carried with them something unexpected, a kind of hard-won clarity, the discipline of long-term survival in an extreme environment, the emotional regulation developed through decades of managed tension, the perspective that comes from having lost almost everything and still found reasons to continue. These are not gifts. They were the products of suffering, but in some documented cases, they translated into lives of remarkable purpose. Norris Henderson built an organization that changed state policy. Herman Wallace, released from solitary confinement at Angola's sister facility after more than 40 years of isolation, a case that drew international human rights attention, spent his last days of freedom in 2013 surrounded by people who had advocated for him across the world. Wilbert Rideau, released in 2005 after his fourth jury, his first one with black jurors, found him not guilty of first-degree murder, became a published author and documentary subject. He was 62 years old. These were not the typical outcomes. They were the outliers, but they were real. The typical outcome was quieter, smaller, less documented. A man who had spent 30 years at Angola being released to a halfway house in New Orleans. Learning, at 60, to use a smartphone. Try to reconnect with children who were now middle-aged. Finding a job, any job, with a felony record in a state with limited expungement options. Managing the daily strangeness of a world that had moved at extraordinary speed while he stood still. Norris Henderson, speaking at a 2019 symposium on criminal justice reform, put it this way: Angola teaches you how to live inside Angola. That's all it teaches you. Everything else you have to unlearn. And yet, some men made it. Some of the men who left Angola after decades carried with them something unexpected, a kind of hard-won clarity, the discipline of long-term survival in an extreme environment, the emotional regulation developed through decades of managed tension, the perspective that comes from having lost almost everything and still found reasons to continue. These are not gifts. They were the products of suffering. But in some documented cases, they translated into lives of remarkable purpose. Norris Henderson built an organization that changed state policy. Herman Wallace, released from solitary confinement at Angola's sister facility after more than 40 years of isolation, a case that drew international human rights attention, spent his last days of freedom in 2013 surrounded by people who had advocated for him across the world. Wilbert Rideau, released in 2005 after his fourth jury, his first one with black jurors, found him not guilty of first-degree murder, became a published author and documentary subject. He was 62 years old. These were not the typical outcomes. They were the outliers, but they were real. The typical outcome was quieter, smaller, less documented. A man who had spent 30 years at Angola being released to a halfway house in New Orleans, learning at 60 to use a smartphone, try to reconnect with children who were now middle-aged, finding a job, any job, with a felony record in a state with limited expungement options, managing the daily strangeness of a world that had moved at extraordinary speed while he stood still.